As the flight attendant blocked the old man's way, she said, "Sir, first class is for priority passengers. You can't sit here." The whole cabin went silent as people watched, some whispering and others pretending not to notice. But no one, not even the flight crew, knew the truth. The man in the wheelchair wasn't just another passenger, he was the founder of the airline. No one saw what happened next coming. Before we start the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like these kinds of stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. The airport was packed with people rushing to their gates, and the sound of their rolling suitcases hitting the tiled floors could be heard. Among them, there was an old man in a wheelchair waiting patiently for his turn. He sat with his back straight, his hands on the armrest, and his thin body draped loosely over his faded military jacket. As he waited, his eyes, which were clear and calm, scanned the departure screens. His name was Robert Lawson. When people knew who he was, they called him Sir out of respect, but today he wouldn't get any respect at all. Emily Carter, a flight attendant, stood at the gate with her arms crossed and looked around. She was one of those attendants who took pride in keeping order and making sure everything went exactly as she wanted it to. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a perfect bun, and her face was sharp when she looked at Robert. She couldn't help but be annoyed. He didn't look like. He looked like he didn't belong in first class. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit like the businessmen in the front rows, he wasn't carrying an expensive briefcase, and he didn't have the polished look of someone who had paid thousands of dollars for his ticket. She took a step forward and stalked right in front of him, her heels clicking against the floor. "Sir, you'll need to wait until general boarding. First-class passengers are boarding now," she said in a firm voice that everyone could hear. Robert looked up at her. He spoke calmly, "I am in first class," and Emily's lips formed a thin line. She had dealt with situations like this before, where people bought upgrades they didn't pay for or were given the wrong seats. She couldn't stand these kinds of mix-ups. "I think you might be mistaken," she said, holding out her hand to see Robert's boarding pass. He took it out of his pocket and handed it to her without saying a word. She looked at it quickly and shook her head. There must be a mistake. Robert slightly tilted his head, but before he could answer, she turned to the nearby gate agent and asked, "Can you check his ticket?" "There's no way." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but it was clear what she meant. Someone like him had no right to be in first class. The gate agent, a younger man named Daniel Reed, hesitated before scanning the ticket. After a moment, the screen beeped to confirm that it was valid. "His ticket is correct," Daniel said, his voice uncertain as he looked between Robert and. When Emily turned back to Robert, she said, "Well, even if the ticket is correct, we need to make sure that your wheelchair won't be blocking the aisle. First class has limited space, and we have to prioritize the comfort of other passengers." Robert didn't flinch. He said, "I've traveled before, I know the rules." Emily let out a short breath through her nose, clearly annoyed. She didn't argue further, but instead stepped aside with an exaggerated motion that said, "Fine, just make sure you don't cause any problems." There were a few uncomfortable shifts among the passengers who had seen the exchange. Some looked away as if they hadn't seen anything, while others exchanged glances but didn't say anything. As Robert wheeled onto the plane, Emily followed behind him, barely hiding her irritation as she quickly reached the first-class cabin before he did. When he got to his seat, she was already there waiting with her arms crossed. "Are you going to need anything?" she asked impatiently. "Do you need help with your seatbelt, or are you able to handle it on your own?" Robert looked at her and could tell she was talking down to her. "I can handle it," he replied simply. Emily gave a short nod and turned on her heel, not saying another word as she walked away. As she did, she said something under her breath that she thought he wouldn't hear, but Robert had spent years in situations where he had to listen carefully, and he heard her words clearly. First class isn't what it used to be, he let the. As she continued down the aisle, she smiled brightly at the well-dressed businessman in the next row and greeted him in a way that he had never received. Robert sat back in his seat and adjusted his jacket. He had dealt with worse problems in his life. He knew when to pick his battles, but something told him that this wasn't over. As the plane's engine started up and got ready to take off, he had a feeling that Emily had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The plane rumbled as it taxied toward the runway. As the low hum of the engines filled the cabin, people settled into their seats and read magazines, adjusted their seat belts, or scrolled through their phones. The flight attendants moved through the aisles doing their final checks before takeoff. Emily Carter, who looked annoyed, made her way through the first-class cabin making sure everyone was in place. She stopped next to a middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit and asked, "Can I get you anything before we take off, Mr. Reynolds?" She asked in a sweet voice. The man looked up and shook his head. "I'm good for now, thank you." Emily nodded and moved to the next row to greet a well-dressed woman carrying a designer handbag. She took her time and made sure to pay extra attention to some passengers, but when she got to Robert Lawson's seat, she barely even looked at him. Robert noticed right away that she was talking differently to other people than she was to him, and he watched as Emily adjusted a tray for him. She smiled at a passenger as she walked by, but her tone stayed cold and professional, as if she felt like she had to acknowledge him but didn't want to. She then turned to another flight attendant, Claire Mitchell, who had been watching the conversation in silence. CLA had only been working for the airline for a year, but even she could tell something wasn't right. "I'll take economy today," Emily said, brushing past CLA. "I'd rather not waste my time up here." Claire hesitated. "But you were assigned to first class today." "That's fine," Emily cut her off. Emily left the back of the plane, leaving CLA to finish the first-class service. CLA let out a small sigh and turned to Robert. "Sir, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" Robert looked up at her and studied her face. Unlike Emily's, CLA's expression wasn't impatient or dismissive. It looked like she cared. "I'll take a coffee," Robert said in a calm voice. "Of course, sir." "I'll bring that right over," she said. As CLA walked away, Robert looked toward the front of the plane and saw Emily. As the plane's intercom crackled with the captain's voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened as we prepare to depart." He might have thought she had avoided him, but he wasn't the type to let things go. He had seen people like her before, people who only cared about money and looks and not about being honest. Robert pulled the strap across his lap and tightened it. He had a feeling that by the time this flight landed, Emily Carter would regret everything she had done today. As the plane took off, Robert felt the familiar pull of gravity pressing him into his seat. He had been on many flights before, but this one felt different. He wasn't just another passenger. He was a man watching a lesson unfold in real time, one that Emily Carter was about to learn the hard way. Across the aisle, CLA came back with a hot cup of coffee and carefully placed it on the tray table in front of him. "Here you go, sir. Let me know if you need anything else," Robert told her. Claire smiled and nodded before moving to help the other passengers. As she worked, Robert noticed how naturally she moved through the cabin, treating everyone with the same level of respect, no matter who they were. She was a true professional, and this airline needed more flight attendants like her. Meanwhile, Emily leaned against the counter at the back of the plane, arms crossed, and was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the other flight. Mark, a younger crew member than Emily but who had worked for the airline for the same amount of time, asked her what was wrong with him. Emily laughed and said, "Did you see him?" He doesn't belong up there. I don't know how he bought that ticket, but I guarantee you he didn't pay for it. Mark frowned and said, so what? It's not our job to decide who belongs in first class. If his ticket's valid, that's all that matters. Emily rolled her eyes and said, come on, Mark. First class is for high-paying. As she lowered her voice, Mark shook his head. VIP is not some old guy in a wheelchair who probably got a free upgrade. Emily waved him off, not interested in hearing it. Whatever it is, he'll complain. People like that don't make a fuss. She turned back to her phone, not realizing that she had already made the biggest mistake of her career. Back in first class, Robert took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind working. He wasn't a man who needed to show his authority or demand respect. He started a company from scratch, hired thousands of people, and shaped the airline industry into what it is today. But if there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was people who used their power to make others feel small. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he wrote a simple message to Emily. He then put the phone down and went back to drinking his coffee as if nothing had happened. Emily had no idea that her actions had just started something much bigger. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet above the ground, the soft hum of the engines mixed with the occasional clinking of glasses during quiet conversations in the first-class cabin. Robert sat comfortably in his seat, his coffee almost done, and watched as the flight attendants moved around. CLA was still helping passengers by getting them drinks and small acts of kindness that most people didn't notice, but those who did appreciated. Emily, on the other hand, hadn't come back yet in the galley. She was leaning against the seat and sighing heavily as she scrolled through her phone. It wasn't like she cared much about this flight. It was just another shift, another normal day where she oversaw the first-class experience. She had worked for the airline for years and thought she had seen it all. To her, that man in the wheelchair didn't fit the image of luxury travel, and she didn't feel bad about how she treated him. But as she stood there, her earpiece cracked, and Emily told her to report to the cockpit right away. She frowned and pushed herself. It wasn't common for flight attendants to be called to the cockpit during a flight unless there was a serious problem. She walked down the aisle without noticing the people in first class. When she passed by Robert, he looked at her not with anger or irritation, but with something worse, calm certainty, as if he already knew something she didn't. Emily ignored the feeling in her gut and kept going to the front of the plane. When she got to the cockpit, Captain Thomas Greer was waiting. A quiet man, Michael Hastings, a senior airline executive, was shown next to him on the small screen of the in-flight communication system. Emily's stomach tightened a little as she asked, "You called for me, Captain," in her usual confident voice. "Captain Greer, don't waste time. We just received a message from the executive office regarding a first-class passenger, Mr. Robert Lawson." Michael Hastings cleared his throat on the screen. "Miss Carter, are you serious about this? Do you know who Mr. Lawson is?" Emily hesitated and said, "Some retired veteran," but the silence that followed was heavy. "Mr. Lawson," Michael said slowly, "isn't just some veteran. He's Robert Lawson, the founder of this airline." The words hit Emily like a slap. Her breath caught as she heard what Michael said. "The man you ignored, the man you treated as an inconvenience is the very person responsible for the company you work for, and he has personally reported a problem with your behavior." Emily's face went pale. It wasn't a small complaint or misunderstanding. It was the end of the captain's career. He let out a sour breath and looked irritated. "We need an explanation now." Emily's hands felt cold as she struggled to find her words. "I didn't know. I thought you thought," Michael interrupted, "that because he was in a wheelchair, because he didn't fit the image you had in your head, he didn't belong. Is that right?" Emily's throat felt dry. She didn't have a good answer or an excuse that would save her. "When we land," Michael said in a cold voice. Emily took a deep breath and said, "Depending on what Mr. Lawson decides, you may be facing further disciplinary action." The captain leaned forward and said, "You may not have a job after this flight, Miss Carter." Emily felt her heart pound in her chest. The plane still had hours left in the air, but it felt like it was already crashing. Emily stepped out of the cockpit, her legs feeling unsteady under her. The door clicked shut behind her, but the weight of the conversation was still hitting her like a ton of bricks, and her heart was pounding in her ears as she slowly made her way back through the first-class cabin. Everything looked the same. People were still sitting in their seats, drinking drinks, reading books, or dozing off. The plane hummed steadily as it flew through the sky, but Emily's life had changed. She looked over at Robert Lawson, who was still sitting calmly in 1A, and knew that he had heard the announcement calling her to the cockpit because he had been waiting for it. As he sipped his coffee, it seemed like he already knew how this was going to end, which made her feel even smaller. She rushed past him, trying not to look at him, and ducked into the galley, where Mark, the other flight attendant, was already folding napkins for the meal service. He looked up at her right away, noticing the change in her expression, and asked, "Are you okay?" with a raised eyebrow. Emily didn't answer right away. She pressed her palms against the counter and tried to control her breathing until she finally whispered, "I screwed up, Mark." She frowned and asked, "What are you talking about?" Emily swallowed hard. "That old man in first class, the one in the wheelchair, he owns the airline. His name is Robert Lawson, and I treated him like he didn't belong, and now the executives know." Mark's hands froze in midair, and his eyes widened slightly. "Are you telling me that the guy you snubbed, the one you barely acknowledged, is the founder of this whole airline?" Mark let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Well, you really messed up." Emily shot him a sharp look. She had spent years running the cabin and choosing who got special treatment and who didn't. She had convinced herself that she was the authority and that she could tell who deserved respect based on how they looked. But today she made a decision that could cost her everything. She let out a sharp breath. "They told me I have to apologize to him in front of everyone." Mark leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "Are you actually going to mean it?" Emily flinched at the question. Was she sorry, or was she just sorry? She wasn't sure if she got caught, but she did know one thing: this wasn't over, not even close. Emily took a deep breath and tried to calm down as she stepped out of the galley. The first-class cabin stretched out in front of her, with people still lost in their own thoughts. She felt exposed, like everyone was watching her, waiting for her to snap. She stole a glance at Robert Lawson, but he hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, calm as if nothing had happened earlier had bothered him. That made it worse. Claire walked by carrying a tray of fresh orange juice. Claire noticed Emily's stiff posture and asked, "Is everything okay?" Emily forced a tight nod. "Yes," Emily said. "Claire, I don't know what happened in front of you, but if this is about Mr. Lawson, maybe you should just be honest with him." Emily frowned and asked, "What do you mean?" Claire shrugged. "You treated him badly." Claire said it in such a simple way that Emily got angry. She felt like the answer was right in front of her, but she didn't have time to argue. She shook her head and walked over to Robert's seat. As she sat down next to him, she could feel her palms sweating, but she kept her face neutral. "Mr. Lawson," she said in a calm but quieter than usual voice, "I need to talk to you." Did not seem surprised, he slowly folded his hands in his lap and turned to face her. "Go ahead," she said. Emily hesitated. On the way over, she had practiced her apology in her head. She was going to say that it was a misunderstanding and that she had just been following the rules, But now that she was standing in front of him, the words felt wrong. She swallowed and said, "I want to apologize for earlier if I made you feel unwelcome in first class. That wasn't my intention." Robert didn't react right away. His gaze was steady and unreadable. He then asked, "Why did you think I didn't belong?" Emily had a lump in her throat. That was the question she had been trying to avoid. She forced a weak smile and said, "It wasn't personal. I was just doing my job." But she stopped herself and realized she hadn't been telling the truth. She had seen an old man in a wheelchair and made a snap decision. Robert tilted his head slightly and asked, "If I had walked onto this plane in a tailored suit instead of rolling in with a wheelchair, would you have questioned my ticket?" Emily opened her mouth, but didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. Robert finally nodded as if he knew what was going to happen. "You still have a lot to learn," he said simply. That's when Emily realized something scary. This wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about whether she could really face what she had done. She stood frozen next to Robert's seat, her breath shallow as his words hit her. "You still have a lot to learn," hung in the air heavier than she thought it would. It wasn't loud or angry, but it was worth it. He wasn't just upset. He had already decided that she wasn't worth arguing with. That was the worst part. She forced herself to say, "I know I made a mistake." The words didn't sound natural coming from her. She had never had to admit fault before. "I didn't mean," she said. Robert lifted a hand, cutting her off. "You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway." Emily swallowed. "I assumed something I shouldn't have, and I really realized I was wrong." Robert looked at her for a long time. The hum of the plane filled the silence. Several first-class passengers finally let out a quiet sigh and leaned back in his seat. "It's not me you need to convince, Miss Carter," he said. "What do you mean?" Emily frowned. "You made me feel small in front of a whole plane full of people. You didn't just question me, you made sure everyone saw it." His tone stayed steady, but it was clear what he was saying. "If you're truly sorry, you won't just say it to me." Emily's stomach dropped. She shook her head slightly and lowered her voice. "Now you want me to apologize in front of everyone?" Emma asked herself. Why should apologizing be any different? Emily's chest tightened. Saying sorry to Robert in private had been hard enough, but standing up in front of the whole first-class cabin and admitting that she had treated him unfairly was a whole new level of humiliation. She felt like she had to defend herself. "I wasn't trying to defend myself," she said. Robert raised an eyebrow and asked, "What were you trying to do?" She hesitated, but there wasn't a good answer. She had already decided what she thought about him before he even spoke. She thought that he wasn't supposed to be here because he wasn't wearing a fancy suit or fitting the image he was used to, and now she had to face that mistake in front of everyone. She clenched her hands together and said, "I don't know if I can do that." Robert gave her a small nod as if that told her. "If you told him everything he needed to know, then you haven't learned anything at all," he said, turning back toward the window and ignoring her. Emily stood there for a moment, not sure what to do. Her mind was racing. She could leave, act like the conversation never happened, and tell herself that saying sorry in private was enough, but she knew that wasn't true. As the weight of her actions hit her, she realized something that made her stomach twist. It wasn't just about saving her job anymore, it was about proving to Robert, the other passengers, and herself that she could change, but was she really Emily? She stood there, holding on to the edge of the nearest seat for support. The quiet hum of the plane and the soft murmur of people talking over their drinks seemed muffled by the pain in her chest. Robert had turned away from her, not wanting to continue the conversation. He had made his point, he had given her a choice, and in his mind, she had already failed the test. Emily wasn't sure if she was ready to accept that, so she looked around. She felt a strange feeling of shame. The first-class passengers who had seen her earlier were still there, some sneaking looks at her and others pretending not to notice. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. If she left, she knew what would happen. The airline executives would still look over what she did, and Robert Lawson could fire her with just one email. The worst part was she wouldn't even be able to defend herself. She had given him every reason to do it, but this wasn't just about her job anymore. For years, she had told herself that she was good at what she did and that she ran the first-class cabin with efficiency and authority. But today, she realized something ugly. She had been using her authority to control people instead of serving them. She had judged people based on how they looked, and Robert had caught her in the act. She took a shaky breath and turned back to Mr. Lawson. He didn't react. She swallowed hard and her voice came out quieter than before. "You're right," she said. That made him turn his gaze to the window. His gaze was steady and unreadable. He didn't say anything, he just waited. Emily took a slow breath. Her pride was clawing at her throat, telling her to stop and make an excuse to walk away, but something else inside her, the part that had been forced to face the truth, kept her standing there. "I was wrong," she said louder this time. A few people turned their heads, interested. Emily forced herself to keep talking. "When I saw you in that wheelchair, when I saw your jacket, and the way you carried yourself, I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume. I thought you didn't belong in first class," she said. "I thought I knew who was supposed to sit here and who wasn't, but I didn't, and for that I'm sorry." Robert looked at her carefully and asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily's voice rose. "Because you gave me a choice," she said. His expression didn't change, but she could tell that his eyes were narrowing as if he was testing her sincerity. She took a deep breath and then did something she never thought she would have to do. She turned to face the whole first-class cabin and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue this flight, I need to take a moment to address something." Everyone was looking at her funny, but she kept going. Earlier today I made a big mistake. I treated a passenger unfairly because of an assumption that should never have been made. I questioned his place in first class, not because of his ticket, but because of my own bias." There were a few murmurs in the cabin, and Emily's hands started to shake a little, but she didn't stop. "That passenger's name is Mr. Robert Lawson. Some of you may know him, some of you may not, but you should know that he's more than just a first-class passenger. He's the founder of this airline, and today I treated him badly." Passengers looked at each other more closely, and people who hadn't been paying attention before were now staring at her. She forced herself to look at Robert again and say, "Mr. Lawson, I want to publicly apologize to you not just because of who you are but because of what I did. I was wrong and I'm truly sorry." Robert sat there with his face blank for the first time in her career, and Emily felt completely out of control. She wasn't calling the police. While she wasn't in charge anymore, Robert was, and after what seemed like an eternity, he finally nodded. "That's a start." Emily let out a breath. She knew this wasn't over, but for the first time today, she had done something right. There were quiet whispers in the first-class cabin, and some people moved in their seats to pretend not to watch while others openly watched what was happening. The tension was still high, but something had changed. Emily stood there, frozen. While her hands were still clenched at her sides, she realized she had done it. She had spoken the words out loud in front of everyone, making it impossible to take them back. Instead of feeling relieved, she felt uneasy. Robert had acknowledged her apology, but the way he said it meant there was more to come. She cleared her throat, trying to stay professional. "I'll be checking in on everyone shortly. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything." Passengers nodded and looked away, but she could still feel their judgment. The apology was out there, and she had to own it. She turned and walked stiffly back toward the galley. As soon as she was behind the curtain, she pressed her hands flat against the counter and took a deep breath. What had she just done? Her mind raced. She had never had to apologize like that before, especially not in front of an audience. The shame was still burning at the edges of her nerves, but there was something deeper and more uncomfortable going on. She had just admitted out loud that she had unfairly judged someone and let her assumptions guide her actions. What was worse was that she had done it so easily that she hadn't even thought twice when she fired Robert. It had been automatic, a choice made without much thought. As she stood in the galley, she realized something that made her stomach twist. How many other times had she done this without realizing it? How many passengers had she treated differently because they didn't meet her standards? How many people had she ignored, snubbed, or made feel small because they didn't look like they belonged in first class? Her fists were clenched against the counter. Was this the person she had always been? A soft voice pulled her out of her thoughts. It was brave Emily. Emily turned sharply. CLA stood nearby and watched her with an expression that couldn't be read. Emily let out a breath. It didn't feel brave. Claire leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. Emily frowned and asked, "What does that mean?" Claire shrugged. "I've worked with flight attendants who would have done exactly what you did earlier, but if they got caught, they wouldn't care. They'd only apologize because they had to, not because they meant it." Emily snapped, "You think I meant it?" Claire studied her for a moment. "I think you're starting to." Emily looked away, her jaw tightening. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. A voice came over the intercom. Breaking the quiet, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're cruising along at 35,000 feet and expect to land at 2:15 p.m. The weather at our destination is clear, warm, and windy. We hope you're enjoying your flight." Emily straightened up and adjusted her uniform. "I should get back to work," she said. Claire didn't stop her, but before Emily left, she said, "Real change doesn't happen in a single apology." Emily's shoulders stiffened, and she didn't turn around, but she heard the words. Saying sorry was one thing, proving it was quite another. She slowly let out a breath and pushed through the curtain back into the cabin. Her eyes immediately fell on Robert, who was still sitting in 1A, but this time he wasn't looking out the window, he was looking directly at her. Emily hesitated for a split second before squaring her shoulders and taking a step forward. She had apologized, but now she had to show that she meant it. Emily moved through the first-class cabin with measured steps, aware of even though everyone had gone back to their books, movies, or quiet conversations, she could still feel the weight of her public apology hanging in the air. She wasn't used to being on the other side of things, being the one being watched and talked about. For years, she had controlled this space and decided who got extra attention, a warm smile, and who wasn't even noticed. She had told herself it was just part of the job, that first-class passengers expected a. She had learned to give better service to people who seemed wealthy and important, and now she realized how blind she had been. She had to stop in front of Robert's seat and ask, "Mr. Lawson, would you like anything else?" Robert looked up at her, but Emily couldn't read his face. He said, "Just water, please." Emily quickly nodded, almost relieved by how simple the request was. She turned and went straight to the galley, getting a cold bottle of water and a glass with ice. She did the job on instinct, doing it exactly as she had planned. As she put the tray in front of Robert, he did something she hadn't expected. He studied her. Not in a condescending way, like he was waiting for her to mess up again. He just watched her as if he was trying to figure out something. She shifted under the weight of his gaze. Is there anything else I can do for you, sir? Robert tilted his head slightly and asked, do you believe what you said earlier? Emily's stomach tightened, and she hesitated. She was caught off guard by the question. When she stood up in front of Robert, did she believe it? The whole cabin and admitted she had done wrong. She had done it because she had no choice. She had been called out and exposed. And while she meant what she said at the time, the deeper question still lingered. Had she really changed, or had she just said what she had to say to stay alive? She cleared her throat and carefully chose her words. I think I'm beginning to understand what I did wrong. Robert gave her a slow nod as if he was thinking about her answer. Then he leaned back in his seat and said, you know, I started this airline for people like me. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Robert asked, taking a moment to look out the window before continuing. I served my country for 30 years, and when I came home, I was different, not just because of my injuries, but because of how the world saw me differently. I went from leading troops in combat to struggling to get a taxi to stop for me. I lost the ability to walk, and somehow that made people think I lost my value too. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. When I built this airline, I made sure that everyone was treated the same, no matter how much money they had or where they came from, because I know what it's like to be judged before you even speak. Emily swallowed hard and said, I didn't know. Robert gave her a small smile and said, of course she didn't. It wasn't mean to embarrass her, it was just the truth. She had never thought about it before. She had spent years thinking that first class was for a certain type of person and hadn't asked who made those rules. She had never stopped to think about the passengers. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the man who had created the airline to break that way of thinking. Robert took a slow sip of his water and then set it down. You apologize. That's good, but an apology only matters if it leads to change. Emily nodded stiffly, trying to push past the discomfort curling in her stomach. I understand. Robert's eyes stayed on her for one more second before he nodded once. Emily turned quickly, walking back toward the galley before. For the first time since getting on this flight, her emotions betrayed her. She felt something new in her thoughts, not just regret but also reflection. She had thought she made this job inside and out for years, but now she was realizing how much she still had to learn. Emily gripped the edge of the counter in the galley and breathed slowly and steadily. The reality of the last few hours was starting to sink into her bones heavier than she had expected. She had spent years going through flights like this. As usual, she dealt with passengers, enforced rules, and kept things running smoothly. But this feeling of uncertainty and self-doubt was something she had never experienced before. She had never really wondered if she had been doing things wrong the whole time, but Robert Lawson had opened up a door inside her. She had immediately snubbed him, questioning his right to be in first class before she even looked at his ticket, and now he wasn't just another passenger, he was the very someone had built the airline she worked for, and he had done it for people like him, people she had ignored. Suddenly, she heard a voice say, "Aha." She quickly turned around and saw Mark leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. I don't have a choice, Emily said slowly. You always have a choice. You just didn't think about it before. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're right. Emily gave him a dirty look, but Mark was right. He took a bottle of water from the fridge and twisted off the cap. Look, I've been working. I've known you long enough to know that you don't mess up very often, but when you do, you double down instead of admitting it. Emily narrowed her eyes and said, That's not true. Mark smirked and took a sip before continuing, You could have just quietly apologized to Robert, but instead you made a scene. Then when the captain called you in, You still tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, he said. That's new. Emily let out a sharp breath and rubbed her temple. Why do I feel like you're enjoying this? She asked. Emily Carter usually knows all the answers, so Mark shrugged. She wanted to be mad, but Mark was right. She had spent years being so sure of herself and sure that she knew this job better than anyone else, but now she was realizing how little she actually knew about the people she was supposed to be serving. The sound of a phone buzzing interrupted her thoughts, and she turned her head to see that the in-flight phone on the wall was blinking. That was strange, because most communication from the... Mark frowned and picked up the phone. It was Flight 281 first class cabin. This is Mark speaking. He paused as the voice on the other end responded. Mark's expression changed, and his eyes widened slightly. Emily felt a prick of unease. Mark lowered the receiver, and his face couldn't be read. The airline's corporate office just sent a request. They want a meeting with you after we land, he said. Emily's stomach dropped. Mark nodded and put the phone back in its holder. Yep, apparently Robert Lawson wants a full report on how this flight went. Emily felt her heart race. She thought the worst was over after she apologized and did the one thing that needed to be done to make things better. But this wasn't just about one mistake anymore. Robert was making sure this wouldn't be forgotten. Emily swallowed hard and asked, "Do you think they're going to fire me?" Mark looked at her for a moment before saying, "Honestly, I don't know." Emily turned away and grabbed the counter again, her mind racing. She had spent the whole flight trying to fix the damage she had caused, but what if an apology wasn't enough? What if she had shown herself to be someone who made snap decisions about who belonged where and never even asked herself if she was being fair? Her breath felt tight in her chest. She had spent years making sure everyone followed the rules, but now she was the one being judged, and she had no control over the outcome. Emily gripped the counter tighter and stared blankly at the silverware neatly stacked next to her. She had thought that standing in front of the first-class cabin and saying sorry to Robert would be the hardest part, but now she saw that the real challenge hadn't even begun. The corporate office wanted a meeting, which meant that this wasn't just a passenger complaint, it was something bigger. Robert Lawson wasn't going to let this go, and if the airline executives were involved, decisions were being made about her future as she stood there frozen in place. Mark moved next to her. Emily laughed with a bitter edge to her voice. "You think I don't know that?" Mark held up his hands and said, "I'm just saying this is Robert Lawson we're talking about. He doesn't do things halfway." Emily turned sharply to face him and asked, "What does that mean?" Mark sighed and ran his hand through his hair. "I don't know him personally, but everyone in the industry knows what kind of man he is because he built this airline from the ground up. People respect him not only because he was a successful businessman but also because he cares about how people are treated." Emily crossed her arms and said, "You think I don't care?" Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and made an unreadable face. "Do you?" Emily opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. She had spent years thinking she was good at her job, that she ran first class smoothly, that she knew how to deal with difficult customers, that she knew what was expected of her. She had never really cared about the people sitting next to her. She had cared about control, order, and making sure that first class stayed exactly how she thought it should be: polished, expensive, and predictable. Today, that belief was shattered. She swallowed hard and felt dizzy. She needed to get out of the galley and get some air, she muttered. Before Mark could answer, she pushed through the curtain and into first class. No one noticed her except the people sitting next to her. Robert Lawson wasn't looking out the window anymore and wasn't pretending to ignore what had happened. He was watching her. Emily's heart raced as she walked past his row and toward the small crew area near the front of the plane. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm down. This was just another flight, just another situation to handle, except that it wasn't. Her hands trembled a little as she reached for a bottle of water, twisting them. She took off the cap and took a slow sip. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, rude businessmen who snapped at her and spoiled travelers who demanded impossible things. But this wasn't a rude passenger, it was the airline's owner, a man who had built everything she took for granted, a man who had lived through struggles she had never even thought about, a man she had insulted, dismissed, and humiliated without a second thought, and now he held her. She was thinking about leaving her job in his hands when she heard a voice. She turned around and saw CLA standing nearby with his arms folded. Emily huffed, "I'm not running." CLA raised an eyebrow and asked, "Then what are you doing?" Emily glanced past her and back toward the cabin. She could still feel Robert's presence and the weight of his stare, even though she wasn't looking directly at him. She slowly breathed out, "I don't know." Claire looked at her closely and asked, "You've been a flight attendant for what, 6 years and 7 years?" Emily corrected CLA. Emily's jaw tightened as Claire tilted her head. "Do you?" Emily asked. "I treat passengers just fine." Claire nodded. "Do you?" Emily curled her fingers around the water bottle. "What do you want me to say, Claire? That I was wrong and that I should have treated Robert Lawson differently and that I should have treated all passengers differently?" Claire didn't flinch. "I don't want you to say anything. I just want you to think about it." Emily let out a sharp breath. "I've been thinking about it," Claire said. Robert Lawson wasn't going to just accept Emily's apology and let it go. He was testing her to see what kind of person she really was. Emily frowned. "And what if he doesn't like what he sees?" Claire held her dazed. "Then you lose everything." The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She wanted to argue, to push back and say that she didn't need anyone's approval. But she knew in her heart that she had been lying for years, believing she had authority. But today she had learned that authority meant nothing if it wasn't backed by. For the first time in 7 years, Emily wasn't sure if she had ever earned respect. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and turned back toward the first-class cabin. She couldn't change what had already happened, but maybe she could change what happened next. Emily walked back into the first-class cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. She had spent years thinking she was in charge, but today she realized she wasn't. The people around her had moved on, some sleeping and some sipping. They were drinking and watching movies, but the weight of what had happened was still heavy on her. She looked at Robert Lawson, who was now reading the Airline's magazine. His expression was blank, even though he wasn't looking at her. Emily knew he was still watching, but not in an obvious way. He was watching in the way that men like him always do, quietly, calculating, waiting to see what she would do next. Apologizing had been the first step, but now she knew something much worse was coming, the meeting. Her hands tightened around her waist. The corporate office already knew about it because Robert made sure of it. That meant that as soon as the plane landed, she would be in a room with the airline executives, having to defend herself and answer for something she couldn't change. She had been in tough situations before. She had argued with drunk and disorderly passengers, handled emergency landings, and even had to take people off of flights. But this was the first time she was being put on trial. Emily went to the galley to get a glass of water to calm down, but she barely noticed Mark walking up behind her. "You good?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Do I look good?" Emily asked sarcastically. "Not really. You look like you just got sentenced to life in prison." Mark laughed. "You heard about the meeting?" Emily asked. And I also heard that Robert Lawson is the type of guy who doesn't forget things like this. Mark nodded. Great, Emily exhaled sharply. Mark shrugged and said, if you go in there acting like you're only sorry because you got caught, they'll eat you alive. He then asked Emily, are you fighting to keep your job or are you fighting to prove you've actually learned something? Emily frowned and turned to him, aren't those the same thing? Mark shook his head, not even close. Emily's jaw tightened, then what do you think I should do? Mark said, give an emotional speech and beg for another chance. Robert Lawson is watching you. Every move you make from now until we land will determine what he tells the corporate office. You need to decide if you're going to pretend to be the perfect flight attendant for the rest of the flight or if you're going to show that you can change Emily's stomach. She didn't like being told she was being tested. She had thought for years that she was the one testing other people's new flight attendants. She had been in charge of everyone who came into her first-class cabin before, but now she was being judged, and what was worse, she wasn't sure if she would pass. She took another sip of water before setting the glass down, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Do you really think he's paying that much attention? Mark asked. I know he is, and I also know that when we land, the executives won't ask you how you feel about this. They'll ask him. They'll ask Robert Lawson. Emily's heart raced. It was worse than she had imagined. She thought she would get a standard review, maybe a suspension or a warning. But if Robert made the decision, she wasn't walking into a corporate review, she was walking into a sentencing. She turned back toward the first-class cabin and forced herself to stand straighter, smoothing out the front of her uniform. If she wanted to show she had changed, she had to start now. No more avoiding eye contact, no more. While she was waiting for the flight to end, Emily looked around the cabin for anyone who needed help. Usually, she would have started with the rich businessman who expected top-notch service, but this time she had to see everyone. A few rows back, an older woman was struggling to reach her carry-on bag. Her weak arms reached for the overhead bin, but she couldn't quite grab it. Emily moved before she had a chance to think. She walked up to the woman and said, "Let me help you." The woman's face lit up with relief as she said, "Oh, thank you, dear. My arms aren't as strong as they used to be." Emily smiled, a real one this time. "That's what I'm here for." She gently lifted the bag and put it back in the bin before stepping aside. "If you need anything else, just press your call button," she said. "Okay, dear." The woman nodded. "You're very kind." Emily hesitated for half a second before saying, "I try to be." As she turned away, her gaze naturally went to Robert, who was still watching. Emily let out a sigh of relief. This wasn't about big speeches or dramatic actions. It was about showing him moment by moment that she wasn't the same person who had snubbed him at the date. She had 7 years of bad habits to break and only a few hours left to show she could. Emily felt a shift inside her that she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent the last few years thinking she knew what it meant to be a flight attendant, keep order, maintain control, and put first. She had always operated this way. She had never questioned it because she had never been forced to, but now she was seeing things differently. She moved through the cabin with new awareness. She wasn't just checking things off or going through the motions. She was paying attention. A young man in a wrinkled button-up shirt sat near the window, tapping his phone screen over and over with a nervous foot. She had seen nervous flyers, first passengers before. First-timers are someone who has had bad experiences on planes. She normally wouldn't have noticed, but now she did. She saw the tension in his shoulders and the way he exhaled sharply every time the plane jolted. She walked over to him and asked, "Can I get you anything?" The man looked up at her, his voice calm but natural. "Oh, no, I'm fine, Emily." "I didn't move you, sure?" It was his first time flying, and he let out a small, breathless laugh. First time in a long time, he said, pointing to the window. I used to travel a lot, but then I had a bad flight a few years ago and haven't been able to get back on a plane since. Emily nodded and normally would have moved on, but she leaned slightly toward him and lowered her voice. You know what helped me when I started flying? He asked. Just movies, music, or even just talking to someone. You don't have to sit in silence and let your thoughts get the best of you. He looked at his screen and said, Want a recommendation? We have really bad action movies on the entertainment system that are actually kind of great. The man softly laughed, and the tension in his shoulders eased a bit. Okay, hit me with your worst so bad it's good movie, Emily said with a smirk. Shark Tornado 3, it's exactly what it sounds like. The man let out a real laugh. That sounds terrible. Emily replied. That's right. She left before he could thank her, but as she did, she saw him scroll through the in-light auctions looking for the movie. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had actually helped someone. She turned back toward the. Before she got to the galley, she caught Robert Lawson's eyes again. He was still watching, but not with the quiet judgment she had seen before. There was something different in his expression. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the first sign that maybe he thought she was trying. The flight went on as planned, but for Emily, it was anything but normal. She spent the next hour going through the cabin looking for ways to make everyone's experience better. She helped a mother calm her daughter down. She refilled people's drinks before they even asked, and she made sure that everyone, whether they were wearing a business suit or a hoodie, got the same level of attention. It was exhausting, but something strange was happening. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was forcing a performance. She actually felt like she was doing her job the way it was supposed to be done, and the more she did it, the more she realized how much she had been missing. She had spent years. She always gave extra attention to people who wanted it more than those who didn't, even though those people deserved it just as much. Now she was seeing them all, and she wasn't just seeing them, she was serving them. As the last part of the flight approached, the captain's voice could be heard over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our destination. Please fasten your seatbelts and make sure all tray tables are in the upright position. Flight attendants would be coming around for final checks. Emily moved through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts and picking up any last-minute trash to make sure everything was in order. When she got to Robert's row, she paused. He looked up at her, waiting. Emily took a deep breath before speaking. Do you need anything else before we land, Mr. Lawson? Was the first question he asked since the flight began. Robert smiled and said, I think I'm good. Emily nodded, okay. If you change your mind, please let me know. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Sir Robert looked at her for a long time and then gave her a single nod that said, You did well today. Emily's throat tightened, and she wasn't sure why, but those 4 words meant more to her than she thought. She didn't trust herself to speak right away, so she just nodded back, Thank you. Sir Robert didn't say anything else. He turned back toward the window as if that one sentence had been all that needed to be said, but Emily knew what it meant. The test wasn't just about what she had done in the past, it was also about what she had done in the present. Today she showed that she was willing to do more to be better, but the real test was still ahead of her. As soon as they landed, she would have to face the corporate office, and even though Robert had praised her efforts, his was not the only opinion that mattered. Would the executive see what he had seen, or was it too late to persuade them? Emily didn't know, but she was ready to find out. The plane landed with a slight jolt, and the soft hum of the engines changed as they reversed. As the thrust to slow the plane down, people around her started moving around and gathering their belongings. For flight attendants, the end of the flight was always the busiest time, making sure that everyone got off without any problems and that no items were left behind. But for Emily Carter, this landing wasn't just the end of a flight, it was the start of something much bigger. As the plane taxied to the gate, her heart was racing because Robert Lawson would be getting off the plane any second now. She would soon be going to a meeting that would determine the rest of her career. Would she be fired, suspended, or given another chance? She had no way of knowing. The seatbelt sign went off with a ding, and people quickly grabbed their bags. Emily stood near the exit, hands clasped in front of her, forcing herself to concentrate. She had a job to do, and no matter what happened after today, she was going to do it right. One by one, people left, and the businessman she had served earlier gave her a polite nod as they left. The nervous young man she suggested watch Shark Tornado Free gave her a small smile and a thumbs up. The elderly woman she helped with her bag whispered a quiet thank you, dear, as she got off the plane. Every interaction reminded Emily of something she had never really understood before today. It wasn't about who people were, it was about how you treated them. Then Robert Lawson stood up. Most of the first-class passengers had left, leaving only a few in the back. Emily braced herself. Robert slowly straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and rolled his wheelchair toward the exit. He stalked just inches away from her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a calm and measured voice, Robert said the words she had been waiting for, "You did well, Miss Carter." Emily felt something shift inside her. It wasn't praise, it wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition, a sign that he had seen her, not just her mistake, but also her efforts to fix it. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. Robert gave Emily a one-word thank you and then turned and rolled off the plane, disappearing down the jet bridge. Emily let out a breath and gripped the fabric of her uniform. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew she would soon. The meeting was set for 30 minutes after landing, so Emily barely had time to finish her post-flight duties before heading toward the executive offices. Her steps felt heavier with each one as she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. When she got to the corporate office lounge, she was greeted by a short-eyed woman in a navy suit approached Emily Carter. Emily straightened up and said yes. The woman gave her a quick look over and then gestured for her to follow. The hallway leading to the meeting room felt endless, and each step echoed, making the tension even higher. Emily forced herself to breathe evenly to stay calm. When the doors finally opened, she stepped inside and felt the air change. The room wasn't full of executives or higher-ups ready to fire her. It was just one person, Robert Lawson. Emily stopped short and blinked in surprise. "Please have a seat," he said in a calm, not mean or angry, but expectant voice. Emily slowly sat down across from him, maintaining a straight back and resting her hands in her lap. "I thought this was a corporate review," she said cautiously. "But it turns out the executives trust my judgment on this matter," Robert Lawson replied with a small smile. "Emily, this was it. Her career, her future, it was in your hands." Emily hesitated, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to say the right thing. Finally, she spoke up, "I want to do it right this time." Robert nodded slightly, as if he had been expecting that. "Why did I believe that?" he asked. Emily took a deep breath and said, "I know what I did wrong and I know I can't undo it, but I can make sure it never happens again." She met his gaze firmly and said, "I thought being a flight attendant meant being in charge and making sure things went smoothly. Everything went smoothly, but I was wrong. It's not about control, it's about service, and today I finally understood that." Robert leaned back in his chair a little, his face blank. "You were heir errant," he said, judging quickly. Emily nodded. "I was." Robert looked at her for a long time, Ben finally spoke. "You're not a bad flight attendant, Miss Carter, but before today you were a selfish one," he said. Emily felt those words sink into her chest. They were blunt, honest, but not mean. Robert sighed and leaned forward. "Forward, you have one chance." Emily caught her breath. "One chance." Robert nodded. "You won't be fired, but every flight you take for the next 6 months will be reviewed. If I hear even one report that you've fallen back into old habits, you're done. No warnings, no second chances." Emily quickly agreed. "Understand." Robert stood and adjusted his jacket. "Then we're done here." Emily Rose felt weak in the legs and didn't know what to say. "Thank you, I'm sorry again." But before she could say anything, Robert cut her off. Give her one last look and said, "You can either prove me wrong or prove me right." He then turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily to let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She wasn't fired or suspended, but she had been given the chance to stay the same or change, and she was going to prove Robert Lawson right this time. If you liked this story, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. That's it for now. See you in the next video.